You can also use the raised hand feature of the under participants. If you click on the participants, it brings up a menu at the very bottom. There's a raise hand feature if you want to speak. And I don't think I can see that, but Kristen can, and she'll tell me. And then you can unmute yourself and speak, and then remute yourself after you're finished, if you would. I think we're ready for the next slide. All right. Everybody, we sent you a link so that you could view the Secretary's report in advance. If I need to know if there are any corrections or additions to the minutes from the last meeting. I'm assuming there aren't, so the minutes can be accepted as presented. Kristen, we're ready for the next slide. Thank you. This is the treasurer's report, and you can see we've extended the budget 2 years because that will give us a better ability to plan and control our finances. So that's where we're planning to go, how we're planning to do the next 2 years. If there are any questions or comments, now is the time to ask them. And if there aren't any, then the report is accepted and filed for audit. Our next slide. You should all be starting to receive the new yearbooks. This year, they all are being mailed since we're not physically meeting. And due to our budget, the entire cost of printing and mailing has been paid for by private donation from our members. So a big thank you goes out to all those people who have cared so deeply to support the Guild. And I really love the cover. Thank you to Catherine, who made that lovely hooked rug. Next, we want to put together a holiday shopping guide. It's sort of a member-to-member shopping guide. So we're asking people who have handmade crafts that they sell to send their website information, be it Etsy or their own other website, to Wendy Beaumont. And if you forget her contact information, you can use your brand new yearbooks to look it up. Next slide. All right, Katie, we are ready for Katie to talk about our community outreach this year. So Katie, if you unmute, the floor is yours.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, great. No, I just wanted to take a few minutes to speak to old members and possibly some new members that don't know about our community outreach projects. Unfortunately, 2 out of the 3 charities that we donate to are not accepting things at the moment, but that doesn't mean that we can't keep on knitting, crocheting, doing whatever we do for them. We've got 3 Neighbors Helping Newborns, and it's inside the cover of your yearbook. It's basically what you see in front of you, and it tells you what each charity is looking for. Neighbors Helping Newborns, looking for handmade quilts and blankets, layettes. This charity would like us to put them in individual storage bags. So any donations that you make, just make sure they're clean and they get put in bags. And keep on knitting through the winter, and eventually we'll be able to deliver them. the Chelsea Soldiers Home, they would like some blankets, twin size or lap robes. And I know we have a lot of talented knitters and crocheters that can help us out there. Now, Tewksbury Psychiatric Hospital, they are accepting donations. We've already donated a few things, but they have quite a need there, 163 patients. And they are looking for, there's men and women needing hats, no scarves, neck warmers, or I can't think of them, mittens, twin size quilts or Afghans. And we'll make arrangements to get them. So if you have something all ready to go for Tewksbury, just give me a call or send me an email, and we'll make sure that we'll plan a pickup date and a spot and date to do that. And also, I just thought of this before we came on, but I'm thinking, I know that we have a lot of people who don't knit and don't crochet. And I think what we could do for those people, maybe we could store-bought mittens, store-bought socks. Everybody needs socks. I need new socks. Everybody needs socks. So I thought that might be a good thing for those people who don't knit or crochet. But if every single member, and we have 45
You
people
are not
on
on
today,
video.
if every single member donated just one thing, this would be wonderful. So I do thank you for keep on going, and think about these people and the children and the babies and the adults, our veterans, who are all looking for something new. It's handmade, or in that case, the socks or gloves or mittens. And I do thank you ahead of time for anything that you donate.
All right. Thank you very much, Katie. All right. Next slide. Here we go. Oh, yes, the October raffle. It is sitting right here behind me, and you can see it's a very large, and it's very heavy too, basket. And we're going to do the drawing for that today at the end of the meeting. And thank you everybody who bought tickets. We have 79 tickets in the drawing. And next one. And now the November raffle tickets are available for sale as well. And the November raffle is an embroidery themed basket based on the fact that during the last survey, 62%, I think, a very large percentage, said they were interested in embroidery programs coming up. So we thought that was worth doing an embroidery themed basket. And it's all in a tote bag that has a pattern on the front that you can embroider. There's a little kit inside that has everything you need to embroider some flowers and clouds on a blue background. There is a an embroidery scissor and holder for it, which is hand embroidered on wool around the base of the spool. There is a handmade needle book, which has a secret inside pocket for a needle gripper and a needle threader. There is a collector's tin of embroidery floss from DMC, which has the first 35 colors of their numbering scheme. And there's a beautiful embroidered country gardens book. The patterns in there and techniques in there are thoroughly explained, and they're just lovely. So that would be raffled. The drawing for that will be in the November 4th meeting. So you're able to buy tickets from now until the day before, 2 days before November 4th. So we think that will be an exciting raffle. We already have some tickets sold for that too. All right, on to the next slide. We have today a program called Deeds Not Words. This year is the 100th anniversary of women getting the vote. I think that you'll find our video show is a timely presentation since we are currently in a presidential election process. The subjects chosen by the artists in the show reflect the national scope and history of the nearly 80-year fight to get the vote for women. Viewed through the lens of contemporary events, the works created for this exhibition are an especially poignant reminder that the act of voting is essential to American democracy. In addition to the right to vote, the show mentioned some of the other rights that women didn't have at the time, such as the right to own property. I think you'll find the show interesting. And now Kristen will have to do her magic to get it running.
Thank you so much for featuring this exhibit and for inviting me to speak. Sandra Sider and I were invited to curate this exhibit of art quilts to commemorate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States, in 28 works from 29 artists. We are indebted to Luana Rubin of eQuilter, who became the exclusive sponsor. Many thanks to Carrie Bresenham and Nancy O'Brien Puentes, who offered the resources of the Texas Quilt Museum to manage and ship the show. Sandra and I split up the work, although she did the lion's share in organizing the exhibit and the accompanying book. She wrote the general introduction to the volume, which accompanies it, and asked me to write just a 1,000-word essay on the history of the battle for women's rights. So I read 8 or 10 books, and I've never done anything harder than transferring that knowledge and information into that short essay. What I discovered was completely different than what I learned in school. The history of the fight for the vote for women was long, complicated, nuanced, racist, exclusionary, elegant, violent, and worth really digging into on your own. We've included a bibliography in the book that would make a good start to your exploration. And I've also been re-watching The Vote on PBS, which is a really well done documentary and covers an awful lot of the complication. So what is suffrage? Merriam-Webster defines it in the first definition as a short intercessory prayer, but the second and third definitions deal with our topic, which is voting. A vote given in deciding a controverted question or electing a person for an office or trust. And the third definition is the right to vote and the exercise of such right. The 19th Amendment, the wording was actually written probably in the late 19th century, but it was not passed until the 1920s, and I'm not going to read to you what's on the screen. But the most important part for us right now to understand is that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, which was the major change at the time. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were the only two names that I remembered learning about in school, but the fight for women's suffrage and rights started well before them. At the founding of the Constitution, Abigail Adams wrote the following advice to her husband, John, one of the founding fathers. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. She was, of course, ignored. In 1776 and before, the American laws were based on the precedent of British law, and only men who owned property, mainly white, Protestant, and over 21 had the right to vote. It shocked me, some of the stuff that I found out I was doing this research. Only 6% of the population was eligible to vote for George Washington, our first United States president. And here's where the kicker was that caused so much of the problem. The founders, in the words of one pundit that I listened to in the last couple of weeks, drop-kicked the issue of voting to the individual states to determine who could vote, and over time, suffrage was extended to all white men, not just property owners, but not to women. I was particularly surprised to find out that Native Americans were not granted citizenship until 1925. And although Black men were granted the citizenship in 1868, and Black women were included in the 19th Amendment in 1920, many obstacles were put in their way when they tried to vote. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the Jim Crow laws and other impediments were removed. So we're going to go through one more general slide on history, and then we're going to jump into the quilts. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is pictured on the right with her daughter, Harriet. And I chose this picture because the fight for women's suffrage was multi-generational. And her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, was one of the women working doggedly in the movement when the 19th Amendment was finally passed. And that's her sitting as a baby in her mother's lap. So Cady Stanton was one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention, which was held in New York in 1848. But she was not the first person to speak openly about rights and suffrage. Many were engaged fighting for social change in the early years of the 19th century. The issues included slavery, temperance, religious reform, and women's rights. Stanton, with other women at a pre-event meeting, drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which included issues about the other rights denied to women, such as owning property once married, the right to an education, the job of her choice, the right for equal pay for equal work, which we're still fighting for, and if divorced, a woman lost the legal custody of her children, even if she had divorced her husband for, say, drunkenness or cruelty. Frederick Douglass, a free Black man, was one of the few who attended the Seneca Falls event and was a signer of the Declaration of Sentiments. Stanton's own husband did not support her work and did not attend the convention. Sojourner Truth was a Black female anti-slavery advocate. Other Black men, but especially many Black women, were written out of the documented history by white historians later in that century. There are now many books and articles available addressing a much wider and more inclusive history of the various movements and how they resulted in the 19th Amendment. What surprised me about Seneca Falls were that many resolutions were passed by those in attendance concerning women's rights, but suffrage was not one of them. All right, we're going to share a few of the works in the exhibit to highlight some of the leaders. I've arranged them in a loose chronological order, and I believe we're taking questions at the end. Chris, is that right? Yeah, all right. So I'm not supposed to have favorites. All of the quilts are my favorites, but I'm particularly drawn to this piece by Shin Heap Chin about the Grimke sisters. It turns out by accident about 5 or 6 years ago, I read a wonderful historical novel about the Grimke sisters. They were some of the earliest anti-slavery workers. They were born in South Carolina into a slave-holding family, but very early left that state, moved north, and freed, I believe, their personal slaves. So I'm going to go back and forth between my own words and reading the words of the artists. Shinhee writes that they dedicated their entire lives through lectures and education to address the injustice of enslavement and women's subjugation. They are credited as seeing the women's rights issue as a human rights issue. She writes, "My work, the Grimke Sisters, attempts to highlight women's independence and creativity that refuse to be restricted by old customs, prejudice, and discrimination. Now, this is quite a large piece. It's 5 feet by 5 feet, and it is all stitched by hand. But to do the images of the letters, she oversprayed, probably using stencils to block the areas that she didn't want colored. And that's just an amazing piece. From a distance, you cannot see the stitches, but the closer you come into it, the more clear they are. Susan Lentz chose to honor Lucy Stone, who was one of the earliest women's rights activists. In 1850, 2 years after the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, Stone organized the first National Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, that had a much broader scope. It brought women in from all over the country. She became a prominent speaker, and her speeches were reprinted in the international press. And here's what Susan writes about her work. From the beginning, I knew that I wanted to create a hinged work that referenced antique daguerreotypes. This early photographic process employed an iodine-sensitized silver plate and mercury vapor to create a very fragile mirror-like surface with extremely accurate and sharp details. Because the plates were so vulnerable to damage, most were presented in special folding cases, often with velvet liners and ornate clasps. I selected Lucy Stone because she refused to give up her surname upon marriage. And she and her husband, Henry, wrote their own egalitarian wedding vows and penned a famous protest against patriarchal laws and customs governing marriage. Lucy Stone stood against all inequalities. If you have the chance to see these pieces in person, this piece is just stunning. The back of the daguerreotype case that looks exactly like leather is cotton, and I believe that Susan did photo transfer and then worked with her quilting to make it look really, really three-dimensional. And in the area of the photograph of Lucy Stone, she gilded it, in quotes, with gold buttons. Those are all buttons that are arranged around that. Jill Pertula chose to honor Belva Lockwood. And I will just read you her words. In 1884, at age 53, before women had the right to vote, Belva Lockwood ran a nationwide campaign as a presidential candidate for the Equal Rights Party. As she said in one interview, "I cannot vote, but I can be voted for." As the first woman allowed to practice at the bar of the Supreme Court, she knew the constitutionality of her endeavor. There had been other fledgling campaigns supported by suffragist and prohibition groups, but none with the reach, support, and credibility of Belva Lockwood. And I'll throw in a historian's comment here. I was watching the vote last night and had forgotten how it was the men's fear of losing their alcohol that blocked the work of women's suffrage for a good long time. All right, slide number 10 is Arturo. Yes.
I just want to ask you if you could move your papers slightly away from the microphone. People are having difficulty thinking.
Okay, I can do without holding the paper up there. Arturo Alonso Sandoval titled his piece, Unsung Heroes of African-American Suffrage. He was researching the suffragist Ethel Williams of Detroit, Michigan, and it led him to discover that many women of African-American descent who participated in the women's suffrage movement. And in his words, I felt compelled to include many of these women who overall were forgotten due to the racism of the time. Since Black suffragists were not given their rightful place among the main women's suffrage movement marches, I chose to include as many as I could in this memorial quilt, paying homage to their valiant efforts in helping push through the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And the book has an appendix in which all of these women are listed. Sandra Sider did a wonderful photo transfer piece honoring Frances Watkins Harper, I Speak of Wrongs. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper spent her entire adult life struggling for racial equality as well as women's suffrage, with racial equality at the forefront of her efforts. Bundle of Humanity in my quilt comes from her 1866 speech at the 11th National Women's Rights Convention, and the strength of her convictions can be felt in the core sentence of that speech. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and the feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. Other speakers that day included Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This event established Harper's prominence as an orator among feminist leaders, and she did not hesitate to criticize racist attitudes among the suffragists. And now, Alice, you're on.
Let me unmute myself. Good morning, afternoon, whatever the case may be. My quilt is called She Refused to Walk Behind, and it's about Black suffragist Ida B. Wells and the famous 1913 suffragist parade in Washington, D.C. Now, some context is required to understand the image and why I've depicted the movement, figuratively and literally turning its back on Black women. Prior to the Civil War, abolitionists and suffragists generally forged a common cause, because neither Blacks nor women were accorded full citizenship in society. So it was natural that they joined together for the advancement of civil rights for all. Legendary abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison were also staunch women's suffrage advocates. And most women's suffrage advocates during this time also pushed for the abolition of slavery. But after the Civil War, the nation turned its attention briefly to Reconstruction in the South. And among other constitutional amendments, the 15th Amendment was adopted, granting Black men, at least theoretically, the right to vote. Some of the stalwart white suffragists, however, were outraged that Black men had been given the right to vote ahead of white women. This racial discomfort led Alice Paul, a white supremacist, who would eventually break with the National American Women's Suffragist Association, to form the more radical National Woman's Party, to organize a faction of feminists who wanted to ensure that abolition and suffrage were not viewed as interlocking causes, so as not to lose the support of racists in their midst. But by 1877, the North had totally abandoned its support for Reconstruction, and the South was left to treat its former slaves as it pleased, which resulted in the adoption of repressive Jim Crow laws, effectively imposing second-class status on all Black people within the borders of the southern states for the next 80+ years. Unfortunately, some of the leaders of women's suffrage movement, including such famous names as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, thought it more advantageous to court the support of Southern racists, even if it was at the expense of the interests of Black women. But Black women nevertheless remained active in the movement for women's suffrage and gave their hearts and their minds and their intellects and their bodies to the cause of women's suffrage, because they saw voting not just as an abstract right, but as a matter of life or death for Black people. So that brings us to this quilt. It's entitled She Refused to Walk Behind, and depicts one incident in this lesser known battle within the suffragist movement involving Black civil rights activist and journalist Ida B. Wells. That's her shown at the bottom right of the quilt. Wells was already a national figure, and a outspoken and courageous journalist who campaigned against lynching when she, at the time that she traveled to the 1913 Washington, D.C. march to join the 5,000 to 10,000 women who would march for women's suffrage on that day. She arrived with a delegation of members from the Alpha Suffrage Club of Black women that she had founded in Chicago. Wells was told by the head of the Illinois delegation that the national organization wanted to keep the delegation entirely white. And so she was told that she would be required to walk, she and the other Black participants would be required to walk at the end of the parade, behind the men in a separate colored section. But Ida B. Wells refused. Instead of going to the back with the other African Americans, Wells waited with spectators as the parade was underway. And you can see the spectators that I've shown on the left-hand side. When the Illinois delegation was passing by, she quietly stepped out of the crowd and took her place in and among the marchers and strode with them into history. The white suffragists should have known that in Wells they were messing with the wrong lady. In 1884, 71 years before Rosa Parks, a conductor on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad ordered Wells out of the first-class ladies' car, even though she had a first-class ticket. When she refused, they forcibly removed her from the train. But Ida B. Wells sued the railroad and won in the trial court, only to have the case reversed on appeal by the Tennessee Supreme Court. Although the suffrage movement was populated with many heroines, in reality, it was much more complex and often turbulent when it came to the relationship between white suffragist leaders and Black women. It was not immune from the racism that blanketed the nation. And while we honor the movement's past, we should also acknowledge its flaws, as well as some of the Black heroines of the suffrage movement. Women such as Elizabeth Piper Inslee, who fought for and won full suffrage for women of all races in Colorado in 1893. Or Sarah Massey Overton, who fought for the vote in California in the early years of the 20th century. Or Naomi Anderson, who gave a fiery, controversial speech at the first Women's Rights Convention in Chicago in 1869. Or Nannie Helen Burroughs, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, and many others. When the 19th Amendment was finally ratified, its leaders went home. Job well done. But what they failed to realize was that for Black women living in the Jim Crow South, it would take another 45 years in the passage of the Voting Rights Act for them to attain the simple right to vote. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them if you put them into the Q&A box. Back to Pam?
Or back to the Pixel ladies.
Back to the Pixel persons.
So we came to do Catherine Dexter McCormick because this photo of her, the original photo of her, stood on our design wall for, I don't know, Deb, 10 years. Deb discovered her by looking, just discovered her at one point, and we just really wanted to work on her. So we actually came to this exhibit kind of through the back door, because when Sandra and Pam asked us to do a piece, Deb said, we've been wanting to do this piece forever. And since she was also a suffragist, we asked, could we do a piece on Catherine McCormick? So Deb, why don't you tell them a little bit about the why of her?
Okay, and Jackie Benedetti had a question. Did each participant pick their own topic, or were they given a list to choose from? So the answer is yes. We were given a list, and Chris and I said, I said, I will only do this if we can do Catherine McCormick. So that's how that came about. She was not only a suffragist, she was a really overall women's rights advocate. She was one of the privileged white people. And when I say privileged, this woman was very rich. So most of her work was behind the scenes, and she funded all sorts of things, from women's dormitories at MIT to birth control, to the birth control pill, and just art galleries, scholarships for women to medical school, all kinds of things like that. So that's why we were really excited to do her.
Right, and And it's interesting that we talk about the fact of how privileged she was. She was a daughter of a very wealthy banker and married into the McCormick family. And for those of you who went to school, we're talking about the McCormick Reaper family. So she was obscenely wealthy. And she took that money and spent it really on advancing women's rights. So while she did have a tremendous amount of privilege, we don't want to forget, how much she put into really putting to the forefront the concept of women's sovereignty over themselves and their bodies. And so, so that's about where we are. So we can answer more questions since we're here. So we want to let you go ahead, Pam. And if you are interested in how we actually put the quilt, the piece together, we did an interview with Lisa Walton, and it's up on the New England Quilt Museum's website.
The link is, yes. I just want to interject here. I said I read 8 or 10 books. One of my favorites is called Gilded Suffragists. And it's about how the movement morphed from, and this is going to sound derogatory, but I don't mean it that way. It was the blue stockings, the Elizabeth Cady Stantons, the Susan B. Anthonys, were not considered fashionable. But when the fashionable women, the rich, privileged women of New York, and other women like Catherine Dexter McCormick got into the fight, they had already for many years been managing the press. There was paparazzi then. And when these women began to become interested in suffrage and women's rights, they dragged the press along with them, and they managed their messages beautifully. And the historian who wrote Gilded Suffragists would argue that it wasn't until these rich and privileged high society women became involved that it really put the effort over the top. So speaking of that, let me go to the next quilt, which is Federation Gertie by Hollis Chatelaine. And I see I've forgotten to put the dimensions on this one. It's here on this crowded desk somewhere. If anybody really cares, we'll find it later. I'm going to use Hollis's words. Gertrude Weil was from an affluent Jewish family that allowed her to have a privileged white lifestyle. She was quite striking physically, and the pictures I could find often showed her beautifully dressed. Even though she was quite humble, her natural leadership impulses always put her in the center of organizing and speaking. So I chose her to have her front and center, looking directly at the audience. Weil was a mover and shaker her entire life, following in her mother's footsteps in fighting for social welfare at an early age. She continued working for change until she died in 1971. The next quilt is by Martha Wolfe, and it's another, of course, I don't have favorites, but I love the story behind this one. We got laughing the other day about who would we really like to go back and meet. And Sarah Bard Field is one of those women who she just must have been such a kick. In Martha's words, my quilt honors suffragist Sarah Bard Field and her cross-country automobile journey, delivering a petition with more than 500,000 signatures supporting the Susan B. Anthony Amendment to Congress and to President Woodrow Wilson. The petition was started in January 1915 by the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, also called the CU, at their Freedom booth at the Panama Pacific International Exhibition in San Francisco. In a gesture to heighten awareness to the movement, Alice Paul, co-founder of the controversial CU, asked Field, a committed suffragist and human rights activist, to escort the petition across the US, gathering signatures as she went. And they went across the country from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. in this car. On a personal note for the artist, Sarah Bard Field was her grandmother's first cousin. And in her words, I can remember hearing tales about her told with great admiration. As a nod to our family connection, I took fabric and lace from one of my grandmother's dresses to fashion Sarah's blouse. The background is made up of antique quilt squares from the early 20th century and layered with silk organza and quilted. Patricia Malacher, in her homage to Lucy Burns, addresses the violence that was done against women who were fighting for the 19th Amendment. In her words, many suffragists were arrested for protesting in public places and sent to jail, where they were often treated like hardened criminals. Lucy Burns spent more time in jail than any other suffragist. She even spent one night handcuffed to an overhead bar in her cell. In my quilt, I took advantage of the visual correspondence of silver mylar strips and prison bars, as well as the sense of grimness suggested by black, brown, and white discharged fabric. Laura Wasilewski chose to honor Jane Addams, a most dangerous woman. Jane Addams was an American settlement activist, peace activist, reformer, social worker, sociologist, and advocate of women's suffrage. As co-founder of Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago, Illinois, she focused on the needs of children, women, immigrants, and workers. Addams was a vocal fighter for the oppressed and marginalized. She advocated for public health reform, universal suffrage, child labor laws, and world peace. One reason I chose her for my quilt is that they live in Chicago, where Hull House is located. And there are several quilts that honor groupings of women, and Carol Breyer Fallard's is one of them. In her words, a photo dated June 2nd, 1920, of 6 officers of the National Women's Party standing in Washington, D.C., holding a banner with a quote by Susan B. Anthony, reminded me of quilters holding up a quilt for show and tell. So I designed a grandmother's flower garden quilt with that quote in the border. In the hexagons, you will find pictures of 20 women who have moved forward the cause of human rights in the last 100 years. And the names of 142 others who have accomplished important firsts. And those 142 others are under the flap. The 162 first ladies and their accomplishments are shown when you lift up that flap. And because we are a museum and we don't touch the quilts on our walls, I did a special label listing those 142 other women that hangs to the right of the quilt. This is our last quilt, and it is another group quilt. Susan Shy did Charlotte, Knight of Potholder Coins, in the kitchen taro. Charlotte Woodward Pierce is my suffragist, and as an aside, I'm really glad she chose her because of this. I was intrigued about this youngest woman to attend the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention at the age of 18, and she was the only one of those women still alive when women won the right to vote in 1920. But at age 91, she was bedfast and unable to vote. Other women depicted here are Stacey Abrams, the Statue of Liberty, Representative Shirley Chisholm, Hillary Clinton, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the 102 women of the 116th House of Representatives elected in November 2018. These women of the new House of Representatives seemed perfect to go with my suffragist subject here, as they wore white on the night of the 2019 State of the Union speech to honor the suffragist movement. There are many other wonderful quilts in this exhibit, and I want to thank you for attending our quick history lesson through art. The book is available through Amazon. It includes all of the images, artist statements, and there are appendices with lists of more suffragists as well as the bibliography. We currently have the exhibit up at the New England Quilt Museum, currently through September 26th. The schedule may change as COVID affects more and more of our museums in negative ways, and the place to see the updated schedule is on Sandra's website, sandrasider.com. And again, one more round of applause to eQuilter for the sponsorship of this wonderful exhibit. And thank you all.
All right.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed that. And there's one note.
And
If you-
Deb and I already
if you would like to see the quilts in person, the show has been extended through October 31st at the New England Quilt Museum. So you can go and see it in person now that you've seen it on video. Glenna still has 3 free passes to the museum, and it's first come, first serve. Next on the agenda is today's drawing for the picnic themed basket. We have 79 tickets in the drawing, and they're all in this beautiful little picture. And I've got one. And the winner is Alice Jordan.
Yay!
Okay. Let's see. We talked about, next we have is the reminders for our next meeting. The November meeting will be History of Redwork with Diana Annis. And I forget what the one, here we go. December will be the holiday celebration with the 3 holiday baskets and couple of quick demonstrations on handmade decorations, I believe. So remember the dates. Don't forget our daily Facebook postings, and get out and vote, everybody. Stay safe and stay well.
Great job, ladies.